This is the Al-Masdar podcast. I'm here with Dr. Ryan Salzman at Northern Kentucky University. He's also an analyst for Freedom House, and he's right now working on some reports for press freedom. So, Ryan, as a member of the press, I can kind of speak to why I think freedom of the press is important, and I think the narrative that we have on Al-Masdar is kind of a testament to that. But in your own words as an expert, why do you think press freedom is important?
Well, I think that we're, certainly striving for an open society, and that's even, more general than thinking about democracy. When we think about governmental institutions, we think about democracy, and that's not disingenuous, but they're not the same thing. So we want an open society, whatever that means, and I think what you're doing here with your media presence is a perfect kind of evidence to the benefits of that, to have as many different ideas as we can, and that through offering those ideas, we can each on our own kind of get to the truth and share the truth with one another, and that's the purpose of an open society. Media are essential for that, and whether it's providing a marketplace for ideas like I just described, or providing straight information, the information side of it shouldn't be neglected either. And so if we really want the best society, the most open society, the most effective, efficient society that benefits the most people at any one time, we have to have a robust, free media.
And it's not even like just about, having a bunch of media, but like what do you do in a situation, let's say we have, media that is supposed to represent the left in a country, and then you have a media that's supposed to represent the right in the country. What do you do when they share a general narrative that doesn't really allow for, let's say, like a third party or third idea to really enter in? I mean, do you think, let's say, that the internet is helping that?
Yeah, absolutely. The internet definitely prevents the control of information and the control of the conversation. So you raise a great point. It's easy to look at media and to consume media, as I talk about in my research, and to feel you're getting, quote, both sides. But that presumes that we have a two-sided society. But the nature, going back to that idea of an open society, or maybe in my head you're thinking open, but I'm seeing like a perfectly spherical representation of this. Well, there are no sides there. And so there has to be this opportunity for others to interject. And if they are able to interject and make waves, then they will demand those, quote, both sides to chime in on it. There are many societies that have the majority position media outlet and then the opposition media outlet. Most societies, in fact, if you are a good dictator, you will make sure that not only do you have a well-funded media information system, but that you have a identified and to some extent supported, and how it's supported is hard to see, but to some extent supported opposition. So there can be that belief. Now, you may support the opposition in the most undermining Machiavellian way, in the sense that you support an opposition to encourage people to email them, to then identify their emails and go after them during the night. Right? That's the really, really negative side. The other side is you just kind of control them. I hate to use this example, but you used to have, long before it was just Sean Hannity on Fox News, you had, I think it was called like Hannity and Combs, maybe? I can't remember the guy's name, but he was the Democrat. Right. And there was a lot of research done. They always had the Democrat. But they do like word counts. Political scientists did word counts of that show, and even non-political scientists did. And of course it was revealed that individual was just put up there purposely to create a straw man for Hannity to tear down. That was the guy's whole point of being there. But it gave it a lot more validity for a number of years because it was two-sided.
The validity, that's kind of just on its face. The general layperson is not going to go out and actually do a word count and pay attention. So for a person, let's say, that works 60 hours a week and doesn't really have the time to investigate the news, that to them it's like, oh, that's good enough. You know, he just tore down this guy that identifies as a liberal.
And we want that, right? We seek out news and we seek out information that agrees with our worldview to begin with. So people who are watching Hannity and Combs, I'm sure I'm misstating that, but people who watched that program back when it was, quote, two-sided were already likely, so, you know, conservatives to the point that they wanted that agreement. So tearing down the Democratic side, they quote, you know, the liberal side was part of the entertainment, and they would have sought that out if there had been an actual even keel debate. So when we think about another kind of popular example from cable, they used to have Crossfire, which was Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala on CNN going at each other, and there was a time that Jon Stewart came on. And he just lambasted him. I mean, you don't have to search very hard online to find this. And he basically tells them that they're both, you know, tools of the establishment. They're both doing a disservice to the people watching. And this gets back to what we know about media and communication, and that there's a lot of different ways to control the message. And one of the best ways to control the message is to choose what you're reporting on. So when you brought up this two-sided thing and that there is some agreement there, well, what they agree on is what stories are important. And what we think about is more important than how we think about it. Just like you know, cover a lot, almost primarily on Mideast issues and Syria and Yemen and the like. Well, if we are told here in the United States not to pay attention to Syria, look at this nice big flashing thing over here, then that's going to be much more impactful than covering those topics and trying to shape how we think about it. That's very, very hard. But to just tell us to think about other things, that's much easier, and that's most often what happens.
You mentioned Jon Stewart, and a long-standing debate in political science is hard news and soft news.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I was in class, I said that somebody said something about, and this isn't part of the question, this is just kind of a side note. Somebody said something like, well, they said Fox News was hard news, and then they said Jon Stewart's soft news. I would say it's kind of the reverse.
Sure.
It seems like comedy to me to say when I watch Bill O'Reilly. But do you think that especially like in a Western culture, do you think putting media, kind of spinning it into entertainment is popular? And then with that as well, and this is something I just thought of, the entertainment value, say, in the current presidential election with Donald Trump, do you think maybe that's why people are paying attention, because there's the entertainment value in somebody like Mr. Trump?
Absolutely. It's, you know, you can go to lots of examples beyond the news, beyond information. We talk a lot about football, and that we know that there's all these gross injuries that occur as a result of it. Yet not only do we still tune in, myself included, and despite the fact I teach college kids, and when I've taught at other universities, that I've taught college kids that are the ones getting those closed head injuries, and yet I can't turn it off even then. And on top of it, we give tax exempt status to this institution on top of it. So it's the entertainment value, and I like to use the term infotainment. That's, I'm hardly the first to use that term, and that it's back to that idea that we're attracted to what what agrees with our perspective and what entertains us. I think you've hit the nail on the head. So if you're more into the nightly news, laugh out loud, or like the nighttime late night programs, laugh out loud is what you like, then you're going to tune into Jon Stewart, particularly if you're a liberal. If you are more into the lambast liberals side of things, then you're going to turn into Fox News. I would argue that they are both infotainment. You were saying, well, I think that Jon Stewart was more hard news, and they're not. I don't really know hard news versus soft news. I think they're both infotainment. I think picking up the newspaper and reading 350 words about an 8-car pileup and how it was unraveled and at what time and how many injuries occurred, boom, done. That's, I guess, what we would call hard news, in the sense that
maybe that's kind of sensational, though.
Yeah, you definitely put it on there to attract readership, but it doesn't have the same commentary that goes along with it. I kind of have a working hypothesis that's not based in anything scientific, that quote journalists, news anchors, more accurately, they're more interested in promoting themselves than they are in providing information. And I think that you could test this by actually looking back and getting transcripts over the last 20 years and looking at the length of questions. You know, when I'm on the elliptical at the gym, you know, when I'm hitting the treadmill or the elliptical, I flip between all the cable news. I'm just trying to avoid commercials. And what I feel is that so often they have guests on TV and they say more than the guests do. Their question frames how you should feel about it. It gives way too much information in what they think about it.
I've heard that before, and kind of what you're talking about. In Professor Chomsky and what's the other guy's name that wrote the book? Well, that's really bad. The book Manufacturing Consent, when they come up with the propaganda model. Maybe not.
Chomsky and Herman? No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe he took it a little too far, but he made that exact point. He said something like, when you have like a total of however long to respond before they cut you off, and like, all right, no. And that kind of shapes a narrative in of itself. So let's say they say something like, do you support the war in Iraq at the time? And then you want to be, and you know, let's say everybody at the time's like, yeah, that's a totally good idea. You want to say something that's not in the general narrative, you say no, and then you have to explain why. They're not going to let you explain why. But no, I mean, I definitely heard that before, that, let's say I've heard from journalists that if you work at a certain place, they will say, okay, well, you know, because you have to remember that a news, especially the mainstream media, is mostly corporate media.
Right. And
they have donors and they have investors, whatever. And if you don't say what agrees with them, then you're not going to have a career there. I mean, if you don't support what, you know, let's say you work at Fox News, you don't support what their CEO or their chair supports, then you're not having a career, you're not going to make money.
And that is important. And one thing we should interject here is that commercial-based media is what helps media be free. That is to say, the systems that have the most problems are the ones that have failing commercial media. So all of their support comes from the government. So this thing that we are most concerned about, the commercial side of media, is also what makes it the best it can be. So, you know, you're definitely, like everything in human society, you're kind of taking, you have to take the good with the bad. And but back to the point about the length of the questions, I'll say for everybody who thinks about it or who watches these programs, pay attention to the extent to which the anchor or, quote, journalist, and I really mean, quote, journalist, asks a question versus makes a statement and ends it with the word thoughts. So I've had instances where I've appeared on various media, not as reputable as this one, of course, and they will just do that. They'll just like yada 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 yada. Thoughts. That's not a question. That's you talking and then putting a word with a question mark at the end. And that's very different. And so interestingly, my best experiences tend to be on the local news because they actually ask questions. And they will occasionally have a sentence, a statement setting that up. But most often they just ask a question, they allow you to respond, and then they ask a question, allow you to respond. But the ones that just talk, and end with thoughts, I think that should be an indicator to all of us that there's something different about this.
Well, they're trying to frame that comes out of their mouth first. They're like, this is the normal opinion. What do you think? Are you going to agree with me or you're not? And then if you try to disagree, oh, that's all the time we got left, right?
Right, or you're just automatically at a disadvantage, right? Why should I have to begin all of this with disagreeing with somebody who's not an expert? Why?
Oh, right.
Why do I have to begin my statement disagreeing with? I shouldn't have to begin my statement agreeing or disagreeing with them. There may be differences there. That is to say, the nature of the story that you're commenting on may already have a pretty clear kind of direction to it. But often that's not the case. You really could break either way, and it would be better to create, back to this idea of an open society, it's better to create space for these people who are best to answer that. You know, watch the PBS, the NewsHour. You know, it used to be the NewsHour, Jim Lehrer. Lots of space. lots of experts talking who are not very interesting or engaging, but they're experts nonetheless.
That's why I have you on.
Right? Oh yeah. I take it up a slight notch from there, but that is debatable. But there's a lot of almost paradoxes when it comes to media and what makes for a free media. In my studies and in Latin America in general, for instance, we know that libel and slander are bad, right? And that governments should likely take efforts to make sure that libel and slander cannot exist without penalty. And I think we would all agree that that's largely true if we think that libel and slander are making statements that are purposely malicious, to hurt somebody in some way. In Latin America, however, it is a criminal offense to libel or slander somebody versus just a civil offense. So this creates a whole different set of scenarios, whereas in the United States, if you did that, there's a good chance that your media outlet, your production company might end up on the wrong end of a lawsuit. But nobody's going to jail. Mm-hmm. But when you have in Latin America or any place, when that becomes, there's potentially jail time, you're automatically giving journalists a reason to self-censor. And when you add to that an unreliable judiciary, or a judiciary that lacks full independence, then you definitely give people a reason to self-censor. Mm-hmm. But this isn't the same as putting a journalist in jail for what they say as much as you're just preventing it on the front end. So that's a very nuanced reality. And so a lot of Latin American states have this still on their books, where if you libel or slander somebody, you could go to jail for up to 2 years. And that's, again, going to have a very different effect than somebody who knows that it could just result in a lawsuit. So it's nuanced, but it's a really, really important difference. Just like with commercial media. You can have commercial media, it can be robust, it can be generally high quality, but then it starts to melt away. We, to some extent, have experienced this in the United States in the 1990s and into the early 2000s with the consolidation of media ownership. We're seeing the same thing happening in some countries in Central America, that you're just having this buy up, this monopolization or a duopoly in some cases of media there, to where they're not supposed to, but all of a sudden there's a group, there's one gentleman in particular who's a Mexican who's buys outlets, and there comes a point where he controls half of the outlets, and then one family controls the other half of the outlet. So you have 12 television stations that all run news, but 6 of them are owned by one person, 6 of them are owned by another. Well, that's a real problem. But again, we're back to this idea. But you need a commercial media system. So there's a lot of difficulty associated with having a well-functioning media system in general, even very, very good ones, like you referenced the Freedom of the Press Index that I work on, and we were talking before we went on air that Costa Rica, which has such a strong media system, free media system, still is far from perfect. So we count backwards. So I guess a perfectly free media system would receive a score of 0 out of 100, and a perfectly unfree one would receive a score of 100. So it's inverted. Costa Rica still receives a 17 or an 18 on that scale. So that's they're still being nicked and dinged on a lot of these things, even though we consider them to be very free and robust.
So I think we've gone over some of the legal difficulties for free press and kind of touched a little bit on the corporate aspect. But what are the other major impediments to free press around the world? Or if we have more time to talk about
well, definitely control of information. You have to look at that. In the countries that I look at, in the 4 Central American countries that I look at, Nicaragua is one of the best, I guess, if you were to admire secrecy. They're one of the most secretive. That Daniel Ortega's wife is essentially the information minister, at least informally so, and all information runs through her. All information runs through her. So, like, in the case of Nicaragua, when the Sandinistas first took power, mm-hmm. You're talking the second time around. You're talking in the 80s, or you're talking in the
80s?
Okay.
Compared to now, I've seen reports that are like, oh, they're authoritarian. Then I've seen other ones that are like, no, they actually did help the opposition run, funded them, whatever, and
mm-hmm.
were relatively free, had decent social reforms and
mm-hmm.
whatever, things like that. Between the first time around and the second time around taking power, I mean, has there been a degradation in press freedom?
Overall, there has not been a degradation. Relative to the rest of the world and the circumstances at the time, I'm less impressed with the Sandinistas as a democratically elected administration, and specifically Ortega. We do always have to separate the Sandinista party from the people who lead it. But the Ortega administration has been underwhelming when it comes to media freedoms, whereas during the revolutionary period in the 1980s, it was quite impressive because most revolutionary movements try to limit opposition, and the Chamorro family and specifically La Prensa operating out of Granada was still allowed to operate even through what was at the time the most oppressive periods.
I mean,
of the revolution.
and like neighboring El Salvador. I mean, if you resisted the government in your journalism, you'd end up dead in the ditch, right?
Absolutely. So, and if you look at Honduras now, it makes me sad. It's actually very difficult. My wife has to hear every time I do this, and it's my turn to work on Honduras. I have to make sure it's a sunny day when I'm writing these reports, because the number of people killed in Honduras, I mean, it has one of the highest murder rates in the world, period. And then that so many of them are journalists as well, or work for media outlets. But now we're back again to the nuance and how it's difficult to get all the information. A lot of the people that were murdered in Honduras, while they worked for press outlets, they weren't. It's hard to tell whether or not they were actually targeted because of their industry that they're in. And now we're to kind of the back end on the policy, which is the criminal justice side, that impunity, so in Honduras, there's this view that people who murder other people are generally receive impunity from being, prosecuted or being pursued by the criminal justice system, and particularly in cases of murders related to, press individuals. Mm-hmm. So that's, problematic as well. So the institutions that guarantee a well-functioning free press are myriad, and you can't separate them. You can't have a free press and have a weak judiciary. You can't have a free press and have a significant amount of gang violence, and that's not even something per se. But if you report on gang activities, your likelihood of being murdered is probably a lot higher than if you report on, dubious governmental activities. So there's so many potential limits to press freedom that it's hard to wade through the muck, which is why we use these 100-point scales. You kind of adjust little parts of it, and in the end you hit go and see what it all adds up to. But then there's also the sniff test part, and what we do know is that countries like Honduras are not free, and what we also know are that countries like Costa Rica have a very strong, robust media system. The United States, very free. We criticized a lot of it, or some specific outlets. But all in all, the United States has a very, very strong, free press system. Comparatively speaking, exactly. But it's not perfect. That is, their score would not be a 0 out of 100, meaning that it was perfect.
I do what I do, and I don't end up dead in the ditch. So
that's right. That's right.
It's whatever. I mean, maybe a watch list here or there, but
But you raise a good point, though. Having done these reports for Honduras for a couple years, I said to my wife the other day, I don't know that we should travel to Honduras. I mean, I would actually worry that my name might pop up, whereas if I get into the country without going through a security checkpoint, it's not a big deal. Mm-hmm. But there's a chance they could look at my passport, input my name, and it's cross-referenced, and I don't know if we should go. Now, I don't have any active plans to go to Honduras, but that kind of speaks to that. There's a certain threshold that gets crossed where you have to kind of worry. And you're absolutely right. Here in the United States, you're good. But I don't know where you would travel to internationally. You should just be cognizant of that, because information matters. And what you're doing is very, very powerful. The pen is mightier than the sword. In 2016, it's probably the microphone, right, is mightier than the sword, and there's no doubt about that.
So out of all the countries you analyze, you said overwhelmingly Costa Rica is the freest, right? Mm-hmm. Where did they have in just how you've analyzed over the years? Do you see them moving forward, going backwards, and what, I guess, are the necessary steps? You mentioned the judiciary. Mm-hmm. I mean, is that one
strong judiciary? And they have a pretty good judiciary. A lot of the problems that exist in Costa Rica are not active problems, or countries like Costa Rica. They're not active problems as much as they are where there are policies in place, there are rules in place that could be employed to limit the press. And there are occasionally efforts made to pull them off of the books. They just haven't been successful yet. But that being said, there was a effort made by one legislator to actually put something on the books that would have limited press freedom. It was pulled before it was even considered, and we could comb through all the records of maybe not the United States Congress, but the Kentucky General Assembly or the Texas Legislature or the Florida Legislature, and probably find individuals who put forth a bill that was just slapped down. Those are really, where Costa Rica, it's a democracy. And like the Churchill hypothesis goes, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. But really the one impediment, and where Costa Rica and countries like Costa Rica could improve, is just getting some laws off the books that have been on there for decades, sometimes longer, that just haven't gotten that support quite yet.
Something we talked about a little bit with one of our former guests, Norman Finkelstein. One of the talking points we have here about is freedom of the press inevitable given the internet. Mm-hmm. Something that he said, he was talking about NGOs. He's talking about Mr. Roth, Kenneth Roth, and Human Rights Watch, and some of these bogus reports. And one of the things he mentioned is Mr. Roth has to know that putting out these reports, there will be backlash, and eventually he might have to backtrack on some things. Which, for example, like when I read the comments on Twitter, I just see people blasting him and other people that will say things. So, with the existence of Twitter, you have. Let's say you have people reporting on Syria here. I mean, it seems like almost every Syria expert I know that has written a book on it lives in the West. Mm-hmm. But then you have people there tweeting about their experience, and they're like, no, it's totally different. Here's how it is. Mm-hmm. And so, you have, blogs now and things like that. Do you think that, with the internet, it's keeping the press accountable, and do you think that inevitably it will be freer because of social media?
Absolutely.
And things like that?
As long as access to internet is widely available, I do believe that the press freedom is inevitable. And you raised kind of two issues. One of them is the idea of people lying or misrepresenting information, or just being wrong even if they're not trying to lie. I mean, that's going to happen, that by virtue of being human. But as long as there's that opportunity to push back against it. I'm an analyst for 4 Central American states in regards to their freedom of the press, and I live in Bellevue, Kentucky. So I can sympathize with that. And it's not easy, and we rely on the people on the ground. That being said, because I live in Bellevue, Kentucky, does not make me an expert on Kentucky, the Kentucky political system, or everything that's going on here. We throw out terms like Paducah to Pikeville, and that's just means for us from one side of our state to another, which are hours apart by car. I can't know everything that's going on there, even though I live here. So the converse to that is, just simply because you live somewhere doesn't mean that you're an expert either. And so to be an expert usually requires, or at least be considered an expert, usually requires just the ability to kind of synthesize the information that is available, and the internet makes that information available, which is what's so exciting to an individual like me. And we want the people on the ground, and we want them reporting their stories, whether it's through traditional outlets or blogs or whatever it is, and then we're able to take it and kind of amalgamate it, smell it a little bit, hold it up, lick your finger and hold it up to the wind and say, okay, so what does this mean? And that's where you kind of apply your expertise. My level of expertise on media is in large part based on the fact that I study media in general. And so to have a comparative understanding of what makes a strong media system and how that informs a strong society is what I bring to the table. And then I'm able to lay on top of it what I observe happening in these Central American countries. But to your point, I'm not the one down there observing them. But if I was, all I could be is an expert in the area immediately around it. And as soon as I was being asked to comment, even if I lived in Leon, Nicaragua, if I was being asked to comment on El Salvador, I would still have to go to the same internet and still do the same searches. I couldn't just, teleport there. So it's good, and it takes this collective mind, and it's back to that open society idea, and that's what the internet gets us to. It gets us to that open society.
What do you think about like hacktivists, like WikiLeaks? I mean, do you think things like that are a good counterweight? Because I mean, like, it seems like now what is happening, like back in the day, you had the Pentagon Papers being released by the New York Times. The Supreme Court ruled on it and defended the New York Times and said nobody should be prosecuted. I remember one of the justices, in their opinion, said that like foreign affairs should be totally open to the public. They should know about everything. I mean, then now you have Julian Assange, which through a UN resolution was said, what you guys are doing to him is in the UK is criminal, and then you have governments just totally disregarding that. Do you think that is an avenue of the press that is important? And I mean, where do you see that avenue going?
So it's disconcerting, no doubt. But to be clear, up until the Supreme Court ruled on the Pentagon Papers, there was utter uncertainty, or in fact, there was utter certainty that what the Times had done was wrong, at least in the court of public opinion. The Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks process is incomplete. I know very little about it, but what I do know is that the world, and at least not the world, but the legal process doesn't unfold at the speed of our Twitter feeds. And so we may be saying something very different holding up Julian Assange as an example in 5 years, 10 years when the issue's resolved, right? And actually seeing it as exemplary of a free society, of an open society, that while there was angst and while there was pain, and definitely the idea that Mr. Assange may be accused and being treated poorly, that in the end the law won out. In the end, our society's values were upheld. And we just have yet to see that yet. But again, going back to that Pentagon Papers thing, there was, while it's unfolding, it wasn't pretty. It really wasn't pretty. And it would have been easy to sit there in that moment and say, just like we're doing now, look, this is a violation of our values. So it's just worth kind of letting the process unfold. But I think that hacktivists, it's the new normal, and I think it's very important, and it provides us an interesting portal. But it's also worth noting that while hacktivists are able to do what they do, they're just going to find individuals in positions of power that try to figure out a way to circumvent them, right?
Like, what's that guy's name? Andrew Auernheimer. He hacked the Ashley Madison accounts.
But that doesn't mean that men are going to stop cheating on their wives, right? I mean, just because you tear down one of those tools doesn't mean that there's now not a guy who's off Ashley Madison and is taken to going back to the bars, and he can get around that because the bars aren't smoking anymore, so his wife won't pick up on it. Just like you will maybe have more handwritten documentation, even though it takes more time. With people in positions of power, have they already gone back to writing things down? I know that I know a lot of people, even in my own industry, that have, in being cognizant that who you work for can look at your emails, much less hacktivists, that you pick up the phone and call people now instead. Yeah. It's just a smart move, because picking up the phone and calling somebody doesn't create a written record in the same way that writing an email does. So we're already finding ways to go around this, but nonetheless, that the role that hacktivists play is central to us moving more towards that open society.
So what about I don't know if you heard what's going on recently, but I guess more broadly, like the data collection by the NSA. Do you think that is limiting the general discourse, say, like in the internet or the press? I mean, do you think that's making people like kind of afraid that they might be in trouble for saying certain things?
I have not come across anyone who has indicated to me that they know of somebody. I'm trying to see how many degrees of separation I can go through here, that even somebody they knew who knew somebody who knew somebody had limited their behavior in any way based on the NSA's data collection and other agencies that, not just in the United States, but internationally, that are, of course, doing these same things, that they've affected behavior. Although I just gave an example of people going from emailing to phone calls in my everyday life. So it doesn't have anything to do with the NSA, but maybe more generally, people and knowing that their materials can be looked at. And a lot of us sign over that right when we come to work for a place, even at a university, especially being at Northern Kentucky University. I'm fortunate in many ways for what's provided to me and my ability to pursue my career, but that doesn't mean that I can start running a business out of my office and use my NKU server and email for that business. Now, that's not, by and large, that's not going to be really considered deviant, but it is in the eyes of the university, right? I mean, it is.
And maybe if you're on the Benghazi committee.
Yeah, right. Well, and I'll tell you, though, the first time I misstep, the first thing they're going to do is, and this could be just in the context of the university, but even if I misstepped in the eyes of the law, one of the first things that they're going to do is come and ask the university to look at all my emails. And I mean, I'm sure that they can get every single one of them going back to my first day here in August of 2012. I'm sure they could get that, and they can go back even further than that in the sense that I've emailed people who became my colleagues here beginning in January of 2012 or December of 2011. So even before I was here, NKU has records of my communications. Now they have, again, the records from the position of the people with whom I'm communicating, but that's a long time back. So that's becoming more of our reality. I think you're seeing some change in behavior based on that. To what extent the NSA's policies are changing the behavior of the bad guys, it probably has. It absolutely has. If they're smart bad guys, that is.
Well, let's talk a little bit about like academic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
How do you in your career? I mean, how have you seen that evolve? I mean, do you think that academics are more free, less free, and around the world as well? I mean, not just here,
I think in general we're all more free. Whether it's definitely talking in the West, we're all more free now than we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. As somebody who teaches political science and even goes on media and comments on active campaigns and the like, I've always been pretty flippant about it doesn't matter. Things like tenure. I've always said it doesn't matter. I don't need those kinds of protections. I've recently heard stories that might indicate otherwise, not specifically about this institution, but just in general, like, well, don't be so sure about that. But yeah, I'd say, there's fewer taboo things to study. I mean, it used to be not that long ago that studying human sexual behavior would have been extremely taboo and reason for you to be fired. These days, there are very few things that I can say in front of a class of 18-year-olds that'll elicit, wide eyes, much less a gasp. So I think that's some of what's changed our perception of academic freedom, that the number of things, again, that are taboo.
But I mean, they're going to tell you, like, okay, well, don't study this. I mean, a clear example of that, I mentioned him before, one of our former guests, Norman Finkelstein. The guy is an outstanding intellectual. Many people who kept up with his discourse with Alan Dershowitz think that the reason that he got denied tenure was because of Mr. Dershowitz and his disagreement. But Norman, he lives in Brooklyn, and the guy has all these universities around him. He used to work in New York University, and he can't find a job anywhere in the U.S. He had to fly 18 hours to Turkey to teach there, and he came back. And I know there's another guy, Steven Salata, I think that's his name. Maybe Steven, if you're listening, maybe I did it wrong, but he very recently he came. He was researching the Israeli-Palestinian issue and sided against Israel, and then I think he got fired. I mean, he wrote a book about it. I briefly glanced over what he said, but I mean, like, things like that. I mean, like, the racy issues. I mean, me and you have talked before about like, some people don't want to study war, and I think like maybe it's because they don't want to take a stance that they turn out and they're wrong later.
Right.
I mean, I know a lot of people like that.
Sure.
And
I don't think that the idea, the worry about being wrong is from the perspective of like losing your job. You would lose your job because you disagreed with the wrong person. You may be absolutely right about it, and you disagreed with the wrong person. But again, we go back 50 years, and teaching communism would have been potentially grounds to be, for somebody to try to fire you, at least. Yet I teach about terrorism now, and we, throughout that section of the class, talk repeatedly about how terrorists are not crazy people. They're actually very, maybe not reasonable, but calculated. They're not crazy. And I'm not trying to paint them in a good light, but I could totally see somebody saying, going home to mom and saying, Professor Salzman said that terrorists are just like us, and you're like, oh my gosh. And there could be both, but it's just not taboo. Yeah. And it's almost expected even. So that goes the other direction, which is how racy students almost expect you to be when you're teaching about things like politics. And if you're teaching about federalism, well, that's no fun. So instead we'll learn about, and they want to learn about terrorism and the like. You're more prone to get in trouble for things like that are administratively related, not submitting grade reports or canceling class when you shouldn't cancel class. And so that's more getting fired for not doing your job. Right. It's rare to think that somebody would get fired for doing their job too well, which is kind of the question about academic freedom. Like, I'm such a good researcher, I'm such a good scholar that I got fired because of that. But that being said, sometimes the exception proves the rule, and I can't speak for every country either. That's another thing that's real important. I don't know exactly what their norms and their rules are there.
What do you think? Over time, let's say people didn't want to take academics, I'm saying, when they were, say, researching Vietnam at the time, researching the Iraq War at the time. I mean, do you think, really, though, there's maybe a sense that people don't want to, like, misrepresent their university or their colleagues, so they just kind of stay silent on that issue?
Well, it's important to bear in mind that few academics are activists, would consider themselves activists. If they wanted to do that, they'd have become directors of nonprofit organizations and the like. But instead, we're teachers. And it's definitely in our code to speak up when something's wrong, but we also know where we have the most impact. So speaking up in your class is very different than running out to the town square and ringing the bell, and which for us would be, I'm going to send a letter to the editor of the Cincinnati Enquirer lambasting American foreign policy in Syria. A lot of us just don't go that far. We consider it our responsibility to educate our students as to what's right and wrong and what's working and not working, but very, very few of us go to that next step of trying to inform the nation or however you define society. So you should never assume that academics aren't trying to teach the truth. It's just who are we teaching it to, and most of us shy away from the limelight.
Final questions, gonna hopefully tie it all in here. Now, where do you think the press freedom and the academic freedom come together? Do you think that, let's say, there is a correlation between the two?
They're all part of freedom of expression. They're all part of freedom of expression. It's just what's informing you. And so, academic freedom, we're being informed by our scholarship, by our expertise in a certain subject matter, even the analogizing of our expertise to other subject matter. And then from the press freedom side, they're being journalists are being informed by what it is they're experiencing and witnessing as well. These all fall under freedom of expression. So they're absolutely connected to one another, just like the ability of individuals who are neither journalists nor academics to go out and protest and assemble. These are also expressive freedoms. And then that is even a subset of freedom of thought. And to have, this open society, a free society, requires that we have freedom of thought. And that's where we start to bring religion into this, people that want to worship whoever or whatever they want to worship. So as long as we have freedom of thought, and as long as freedom of thought is a value that's protected by the institutions of a country or a political system, then we will be able to have academic freedom. We will be able to have freedom of speech. We will be able to have press freedom. We will be able to have freedom of religion and freedom of assembly. And so all of those are just a subset of this really core value of freedom of thought. And so I feel that in our society, we do pretty well. Are we a 10 out of 10? We tend to be somewhere between a 9 and a 10. But the reality is that things are rarely scaled on a 0 to 10 scale. It's more like 0 to 1,000. And so there's going to be a lot of nuance there. But that freedom of thought, it's very important.